This evening, I am in Hartford, Connecticut, in the new University of Connecticut Law School Library, and I'm talking with Darcy Kirk, who is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Associate Dean for Library and Technology, and Professor of Law here at the School of Law. Do the students have to call you Dean, Professor, or are you a little less more casual?
Sometimes they want to say Dean squared.
Ah,
They definitely call me Dean.
yeah. Dean is a title that does sort of command respect in the academy. I held it for a few years and
Yeah.
sort of enjoyed having that title.
Yeah, well, I was very excited when I became professor, and then when I became a dean, I was like, wow, this is cool.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you know, the professor is the important party
Right.
to the whole thing. The deans just sort of keep the place running.
Exactly.
But in the hierarchy of usual titles, the assumption is since the head dean is the boss of the place, little do they know about how that is with faculty.
and I recently got a new title of Distinguished Professor of Law.
Oh, now that is
So
important, because that doesn't
that
always
that
come.
was a nice one.
Yeah, that or a chair or a
Yeah.
name, that's important to know. So
So
I'm glad you
just-
mentioned it, Darcy.
Just a month ago, so
Oh.
in August. Yeah.
Well, I don't feel totally incompetent having listed then.
No.
That's good. Well, it's sort of our custom to begin conversations of this sort by asking you a little bit about yourself, your life as an individual, as a real person. Could you tell us a little bit about what life is like, perhaps not just now, but perhaps when you were younger as well?
Yeah, so I can tell you a little bit about my childhood. My father was a career naval officer, so we lived all over the country. Every 3 years I was in a new school, and I think that actually made me enjoy meeting new people, and I certainly have throughout the course of my career as a law librarian. And when I worked in libraries from high school on, although I never thought I would become a career. And then lo and behold, here I am all these years later. So,
Well, so here you are. So you are grew up in the Navy is it a Navy brat? I know it's an
Right.
Army brat, but
Yeah.
were you ever did you ever live out in Washington State, Whidbey Island, at the naval station there?
no, we did live in California and San Diego.
Okay, well that's a nicer place.
that
in
was
my
very
opinion,
nice.
at least in the winter.
Yeah, it was very nice. So we lived there. We lived in Norfolk, Virginia. I was actually born in London, England. My father was, right after World War II, was somehow connected with the U.S. Embassy, so we were there.
Oh yeah.
And then lived also in Northern California as well. And then my father retired, and we moved to Massachusetts.
So did he have a second career then?
He did have a whole second career in academia, which is why I think I sort of ended up in academia myself. I mean, I think, as I said, I was interested in libraries, but I think becoming an academic librarian was really through sort of seeing the kind of wonderful second career he had. In fact, he worked at Harvard Business School. He was associate dean for administration or whatever. I'm not.
So decanal titles
Yeah,
go in the family
exactly.
too.
There
Good.
you go. So, and then I actually worked in the Harvard Business School library for 2 summers while I was an undergraduate, and so I found out that Harvard had a program. They called it. Now I'm going to forget, but I think it was called Library Intern. And what it was you were employed as a full-time employee, as really a library assistant, but you were being trained to become a librarian. And part of what they did was they provided money for tuition to go. We all went to Simmons College, which was the library school in Boston, and they even gave us extra time off around exams. And and as I say, we were sort of really sort of treated differently than the other library assistants because we were becoming full-time librarians, and then we were actually promised a position when we finished our degree.
Boy, life has
So,
changed.
yeah, exactly.
Hasn't it? I mean, now that would presumably be illegal to start with.
Exactly.
Under the civil rights legislation
Exactly.
and so on, but
So, so then I
economics
worked
wouldn't
there.
work this time either, probably.
So I worked there at Harvard Library, the Widener Library, as a cataloger well, I finished my library degree after 2 years, and so, worked full-time, went to school part-time, and then stayed there for almost 10 years at
Wow.
Widener Library.
It's a good, very sophisticated library, so you must have
Yeah.
had wonderful experience.
It was a great opportunity. I was hired to catalog French materials. I had a background in French and the French language and literature, and so the majority of my job when I first started was really just cataloging materials just in the French language. And then over time, I sort of moved myself up the ladder. It was at the time that OCLC was just being started, so online cataloging as it is today, it was just beginning in those days, in the early 70s. And so there were just a handful of us. Another one is a name that you may recognize, not a law librarian, but a very well-known librarian, Sarah Thomas, who's now
Yes.
the librarian at Harvard again. She and I began within weeks of each other in the same library intern program. And she did German language, and I did French language, and we went in we had very different career paths, but it was a wonderful training opportunity. And there was lots of opportunity because it was such a large department cataloging. There was a lot of opportunity to sort of move up. So I became the person who trained. We ended up hiring a large number of what we call copy catalogers today, and I was in charge of that whole copy cataloging department, which really had maybe 20 full-time people. And then I went into something that was called department library cataloging, and so I cataloged for all what they call the department libraries throughout Harvard, math, science, whatever, and even like some of the art library as well. And then ultimately I decided I needed a second degree because I just had at that point the library degree, and at that point as an academic librarian I felt the need to have a second master's. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what that would be. One thing was maybe get a master's in French, some other field, but ultimately I decided on an MBA. And so I began a program at Simmons. Simmons College had started a program at that time for all women only in business. And so I did that program. Again, while I was working part-time, I went out to part-time and then went to school full-time and did that degree in a year. And then I came back full-time, and they created this position for me to be sort of the assistant to the university librarian. So I did that for a couple of years, so I had a lot of opportunity for growth and also for leadership and management and supervisory opportunities.
There were a few of our colleagues who got the MBAs back in a day, or the day, or however they put it. But there weren't an awful lot of them that I knew about.
Yeah.
But you're one of them.
Yeah, I found it very useful as a degree, just for the workplace to understand sort of what makes people tick a little bit, and
Probably very useful in your role as an administrator and supervisor.
absolutely, and also things like strategic planning and just really thinking about the big picture. I think that's one of my strengths. So.
Well, I know that you have actually 4 degrees. You've mentioned now 2 of them.
Right.
You want to tell me what
Sure.
is missing from the list
Exactly.
currently?
So my undergraduate degree is in political science from Vassar College, and then, as I said, I have the 2 degrees from Simmons, the library degree and the business MBA, and And then I ended up working at a law school. So when I finished the management assistant position, which was really just a 2-year appointment, I started looking for another position. And Boston College Law School Library had a very new director. Her name was Sharon Hamby, and she's now Sharon Hamby O'Connor. And she and I knew each other from Harvard because she had been the director at Lamont Library, one of the 2 undergraduate libraries. So she reached out to me for a position they had there as head of technical services. And so I, went for an interview and ultimately got that position. And so there I was in a law library. And if truth be known, I had always been interested in law and had actually considered going to law school, but going at night seemed like a difficult endeavor, and so I had sort of put that off. And but I had an undergraduate degree in political science, and definitely an interest in law. And so when I got to BC, I found that I really was enjoying working with the materials, and I was learning a lot. Oh, and I also should say that while I was at Widener, I added, because I was working, behind the scenes all that time as a cataloger, and I have, as I said earlier, I like to meet people, and I wasn't meeting too many people except for my colleagues in the catalog department. So I don't even remember how it happened, but I was able to land just an evening position at the reference desk at Widener Library. So I worked there one night a week for 5 hours, from 5 to 10. And in those days, obviously, there was not an online catalog. It was all cards, and I was one of the people who basically wrote those cards, because we did pretty much only original cataloging. So I really knew how those records were created, added entries, subject entries, whatever. And so I actually was really good at the reference desk because I could find things in the card catalog.
Yeah, you knew how to work the system from the other side, too.
Exactly,
yes.
And so I was sort of a valuable addition to the reference desk.
Yeah.
And so when I got to BC, I continued working one night at the reference desk even there. And I just could tell this was an area that I was going to want to stay. But what really made all the difference was, so that was the early 80s, and I went to my first AALL meeting it was in DC, and I just remember just being blown away by the people, the law librarians. They were smart, they were interesting, they were engaged, they were working on projects and reading and writing in areas that was just really fascinating to me. And I decided I had found my home. This was what I wanted to do.
Good.
So.
Well, I know we hopefully did a nice job since I was in D.C. I was
Right.
part of the local arrangements group, and we were at the Washington Hilton for that meeting. We were still able to meet in an individual hotel if it was big enough, and that one was.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you one little story. We had at the exhibit hall, Steve Marginson and I were sort of overseeing that, and I got apprehended by somebody when I was carrying a box from the street into the exhibit hall, and that was work that the official people had to do, and so I dutifully turned it right over, and that was taken care of. But learned something that day. So I think you've already kind of answered how it was you sort of gravitated into law librarianship, but specifically, did anyone individual play a role in that? You may have mentioned that too, but I'll ask it directly in case there was a little somebody that assisted.
Well, not really. I have to say, as I was saying earlier, I had been interested in law school and had actually applied at one point and didn't go to law school. And so when I got to BC, I sort of I was sort of thinking about going to law school, and and I didn't really answer the question about sort of the law degree. So BC does not have a part-time program. It's a full-time only school. But there were several on the staff who were interested in going to law school. And so the dean just sort of said, let's, to whoever it is, the registrar, whoever, let's make it happen. And so we did. So we went to school just during, as I used to say to my friends, 1 minute I was, working at the reference desk or in an acquisitions meeting, and the next minute I was in torts class or whatever it was. And so it was a little bit schizophrenic because, I had to take class during the day. There were some evening classes, but obviously the first year classes were not evening class, and a lot were not. So I just sort of went back and forth, and I am very grateful for, again, the director, Sharon Hamby O'Connor, who basically let me do it, and because it took a number of years, and but I felt very lucky to have that opportunity, and it was a wonderful education. And I have to say, people, from time to time you hear complaints about law school and what a slog it is, but I loved every minute of it. I just thought the education was fascinating, what I was learning, the way of thinking, how to analyze from sort of the lawyer's point of view, think like a lawyer. I loved it. And so I felt very lucky to have that opportunity. And over time at BC, as I said, so really if anyone was instrumental, it was Sharon, because she was the one who recruited me for the position, and then she supported my going to law school. And she also supported very much my work with ALO. There were several of us at BC who were interested in becoming involved professionally, and she fully supported us, attending annual meetings, taking the time we needed to, be involved in programming, or and also local, regional groups as well. She supported it financially as well as obviously the time off from work.
That was beginning to become more common in the law schools, but even up until that time, often the head librarian, maybe one subordinate, the associate or somebody would go to the annual meeting, and we started where I was to empower the other librarians to go by just sort of redistributed the money, and somehow I got away with it, and it was the beginning of the expansion of the number of people that libraries would send.
Right, and since I've been here at the University of Connecticut, I've felt like it's my role to continue that practice of sending as many people as I can to those meetings.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to pay everybody's full expenses because they never knew what their real situation at home was.
Right.
Yeah, so we sort of eliminated three of us going to the AELS meeting. In a sense, I was the only one that really needed to go, but it was a nice little benny for
the others.
But we talked about it and decided that would be better put to this. And I
that's
would go
idea.
Occasionally to ALS, but
Right.
it was always troublesome to be traveling at that time of the year, which is right after Christmas.
Right, exactly.
My wife was sort of resistant to being enthusiastic about that.
Right.
So it made it a little bit easier for me to set the priorities the way I did. Yeah. Well, you've sort of already explained what it was like to be a law student and a working librarian in the same place. And did you ever have any sense that there were any conflicts or anything in your life about that? Or?
I mean, it was, I think one thing that made it work a little better was that I wasn't as well known in the law school because I was still,
we call it the back office.
I was still in the back office. As I said, I worked one night a week reference. But mostly I wasn't as well known, and so I could sort of slip in and out of class. And I got to know the students fairly well as a co-student. I never taught, I was never a teacher there, so I didn't have to run into that issue because the librarians at that time did not teach legal research.
Oh.
Now they do, but
Yeah.
when I was there, they did not. So, but the faculty was sort of an interesting thing because some of them never did figure out I was even in their class, and then others were like, "Were you in my class?" Yeah. So it was pretty funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, and there, it was a great faculty, and I felt again privileged to have had the opportunity.
Good. Well, you got the degree, your last of your 4 degrees,
Right.
law degree, and then you ended up moving a tad south to Baltimore.
Correct.
In the University of Baltimore Law Library.
Correct, or the University of Maryland.
Oh, I'm sorry, I
that's okay.
misspoke. You're right.
But even before that, I struggled a little bit with wanting to practice. And I think, when I talk today to young law librarians, some of them, have practiced first, or people are just finishing, and and I always encourage them if they're when in doubt, go ahead and practice because I think it's a really useful thing. Because I had young children at the time, it was more difficult for me to sort of make that switch, so I didn't. But I think it's something that I would recommend to others if they have the opportunity to do it. But no, so I finished my my law degree, and then I was looking for something. The next step, and I really wanted to move out of technical services because although I had moved into, by the time I left BC, my title had changed to something like, I don't know, collection, maybe assistant director for collection development and tech services or something. So I'd sort of added on collection development responsibilities because I had sort of learned, a lot more about the collection, and of course had the law degree.
Yeah.
So I had a lot more going for me. However, I still didn't really have, as you and I both know, the sort of the traditional path to becoming a director, which I decided I wanted to do, is through reference, sort of reference, head of reference.
Public services.
Head of public services.
Mostly
whatever.
reference.
Yeah, and I didn't have that path. So, I started looking for something. And at first it was hard because people were willing to hire me as a reference librarian, but nothing else.
Oh.
And I was like, but I have all these years of experience. I really don't want to start in an entry-level position. But again, this is where knowing somebody really helped because Barbara Gaunt, I had worked, by that point I'd, become quite active in ALL. And where I started was with their placement program. At that point, placement was done, Barbara Gontram did ALL placement sort of out of her office. And ALL funded a half-time person because, again, it wasn't really online, so they had all these files of people looking for work and people who had positions open. and then at the annual meeting, they would have a placement area, of course, which they still do.
Yes.
And so Barbara and her staff person was sort of, help facilitate matching up some of those positions.
It was sort of an ALL pattern on occasion.
It was, yeah.
I remember in your next job, I'll jump ahead. I did that.
Yeah, right.
Your director,
Right.
Bob Oakley, had one of those sort of ALL jobs on the
Correct.
side with an assistant of some sort
That's
provided by them.
Yeah.
That was the Washington Affairs.
The Washington Affairs position, exactly. So ALL, that was a different time, and also they didn't have the large staff that they have now.
No, they were just about to
Yeah.
begin building it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, so Barbara, I had worked on I guess it was called the placement committee, and she was the chair, and I had worked with her, so she knew me. So she had a position of, I think, head of reader services. I don't really remember the exact title, and so. I ended up getting that position, and so we ended up in
Yeah,
Baltimore.
the bio that I saw about you had the title Assistant Director of Research Services.
That sounds right.
That might have been it.
That might have been it.
That's what you must have filled in someplace, and I saw it at some point.
Right.
Well, that would be a nice broad. Basically, it's head reference and
Yeah,
whatever else.
exactly.
Yeah.
It was actually a perfect job. What was interesting about that job was I wasn't just over like reference and I was over, reference and circulation, but I was also over. They had a whole media. In fact, I think Maryland still does. They had this whole media department, which did things like filming classrooms and events. And
We're ahead of the curve on that one.
Yeah.
And that came in later,
exactly.
most of our places.
And then they sort of, IT was started to be tucked in there.
Yeah.
And so I was over those folks as well. And that was a new happening. And I also then started, Maryland did a lot of 1L teaching, so I did that as well.
So that's when you got into research and did you do writing as well, or just the legal research part?
It was just the legal research part,
Okay.
correct.
So they had a separate writing teachers, presumably.
Correct. But we worked very closely with them. It was a
Oh,
very...
I understand that
yeah.
would be necessary.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So you began teaching when you were at Maryland. You were there
Correct.
roughly about a year. as
Yeah,
I
about a year,
recall.
yeah.
And then you did move down, where I sort of jumped us ahead a few months
Right.
ago to some place in Washington, D.C. Oh, yes, Georgetown
Right.
Law School Library, which is that's quite a leap from the University of
Yeah.
Maryland or just about any other place in
Right.
terms of size of the operation,
Right.
depth of the collection development, and just about everything. So you want to talk a little bit about some of the things you were involved in at Georgetown?
Yeah, I mean, that was a very big job. But I didn't feel overwhelmed by it because Harvard was, having worked at a large place, I was comfortable in a large setting.
That's right, Widener would sort of
Yeah.
be even bigger.
I mean, obviously, I didn't have as high a level of job at Widener, but I always had large staffs. So when I went to Georgetown, the size didn't bother me, and I knew Bob. We had, again, through ALL, I had
Yeah.
met him, and so I think we knew that we would have a good working relationship. The other staff there were, really, really good and obviously smart, and I learned a lot. Bob gave me a lot of rope, as it were.
I think that was his style.
Yeah, that was his style.
He tried to get
Yeah.
good people, and I don't want to say give them enough rope to hang themselves,
yeah.
because fortunately
Yeah.
it was not a norm that anybody
yeah,
did.
Yeah, and it was a place where you have had the opportunity to really grow and stretch your wings and try things. And as I said, I had a large staff there, and it was the school, a lot going on there, and I did some teaching there as well. So Bob and I started out teaching the first ever advanced legal research course there. We co-taught it for 1 year, and then after that, it was mine. I taught it by myself.
He had some
And,
other things on his plate, perhaps.
Right. He was busy, and he was very busy with, not just, of course, his job as the director of the law library, but also he was very active in AALL. He was the president. He also was the head of what they called their Washington Affairs office at that time. And then he had a second staff person, first Susan Toulis and then Mary Alice Bache, who actually worked in the law library. So they were great colleagues to have as well.
Mary Alice had been at the American University at the University Library,
Right.
and I was president of ALL at the time that we were, Susan was leaving or had left,
Yeah.
and we were going to be recruiting, and Mary Alice applied, dynamite credentials, and of course I knew her on the campus where I was, and I knew she was a keeper if we could, but I didn't know who else had applied, so we had to really look. But Then then we hired her. And I had faced my counterpart at the university library sort of sheepishly for poaching one of her best people.
Right, yeah.
But, the librarian was actually really pleased to
Yeah.
see somebody move on.
Yeah.
She's such an interesting kind of a position.
Yeah.
And speaking of interesting positions, your title actually there, from what I've seen also, was Associate Law Librarian for Public Services. So you had a little bit broader
Correct.
sounding title.
Right.
It sounds like you basically, with a slightly narrower title, had the same job at Maryland, though, pretty much.
Yeah, well, it really was the same job in terms of there was still a separate librarian in both places who sort of did sort of administrative kinds of things under the librarian, and then I was sort of in charge of all the public services, again, a large staff. I think what was new at at Georgetown was adding in special collections. So I had special collections under me, and then of course circulation, reference, and stack maintenance, that kind of thing. But it was a busy job, lots going on, and we were starting to really do more teaching and more outreach, and really sort of work on faculty services, student services, that kind of thing. So
Yeah. I think of all the academic libraries in town, when I first came, which is just a few years earlier, about 10 years earlier, George Washington was pretty much a fairly sophisticated operation. Under Hugh Bernard was the library director. Georgetown, American Catholic,
Right.
Howard were not quite there yet, although our generation of leaders, that was
Right.
part of our
Right.
plan, and
Right.
hopefully we're able to
Right.
achieve it.
Right.
But Georgetown certainly became a leader in terms
Right.
of how I would describe a fairly diverse and sophisticated entire operation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you were there during that part.
Yeah, it was, we really, I think our services improved dramatically. We, the faculty was growing quite rapidly. There were a lot more, as many schools across the country have added, a lot more foreign LLMs coming in, and other kinds of LLM programs. And so there's just was a growing need for more faculty, more, and then the library staff wasn't necessarily growing, but we were looking at different ways to connect with all of those different patron groups. So
You were there when the new building was opened. Is that correct?
no, it had opened just a few years before, I believe. Yeah. But so they were still, when I got there, they were definitely still settling in and figuring out,
So you don't remember
Yeah.
the old library? In fact, when I came, there was a huge stairway up and came up, and you had to walk up
I
to
had
that.
seen the old library, but I had never
Yeah,
been in it.
and then you'd enter the library, and they had the security system up there and
Right.
everything. Mhm.
Right.
And I thought, boy, if you had a weak heart, that was not the place to visit.
Right.
Although I think they did have an
Yeah.
elevator.
Yeah, and while I was there, they were increasing the size of the law school. They added a whole nother building where they actually put all the foreign and international collection went into this other building.
Yeah, I
So,
remember
yeah.
when they sort of
Gewertz
developed their
building,
own
yeah,
little
right,
campus
exactly.
on its own. Because,
Right.
for those who don't know, the Law
Right.
Center has traditionally not been on the Georgetown main
Exactly,
campus.
right.
It's actually down fairly close to the Capitol,
Right.
down on Capitol Hill.
Right.
They put together a really attractive campus
Yeah,
down
it's
there
very
for
beautiful.
the law
Yeah.
school itself, with
Yeah.
several buildings now,
Right.
tons of students last time I checked.
Right. Lots of students.
Yeah.
Yes. It was. That was the thing that was hard for me, having worked at a smaller, medium-sized, I guess, law school, BC, Georgetown, and Maryland as well. Georgetown was, exponentially larger in terms of student body and faculty, and sort of learning names was, pretty difficult.
Well, when I first went to American across town from Georgetown, we used to brag that we were a small
Right.
law school. That didn't last very long.
Right.
We too were adding students.
Yeah,
and
you were
became
large. Yeah.
never as large as Georgetown, but we certainly gave
Yeah.
some of the other places a run for their money
Right.
on
Right.
enrollments. So it was
Well,
did cause growing pains too.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great place to go to law school in DC, you know,
Yes.
with all the job opportunities and great internship opportunities and things like that.
Hmm. Well, that sort of brings me to the, I think it may be the capstone of your career, but who knows?
Right.
It's only been 20 years
That's
since
right.
you arrived here at the University of Connecticut, up here in in Hartford.
Yeah.
And I say 20 years, that's
Right.
a career in its own. But you want to talk a little bit about how it was you decided to leave the DC area and come north to Connecticut, and specifically here, and perhaps some of your experiences.
Yeah, so obviously going to Georgetown was just a great job, but the people in that position who had preceded me had all gone on to becoming a director, and I knew that was what I wanted.
That continues.
And Bob knew that as well, and so I was sort of, waiting for the right opportunity. I think I was there 5 or 6 years, and got to see Bill Clinton be inaugurated, and it was a fun place to live, and it was a fun place to work because of the location. But my husband and I were from New England, and so when this job came open at UConn, I decided to throw my hat in the ring, and and here I was, and the new law library it's 20 years old now. If we still call it the new law library, was opened that fall, and so basically I started on July 1. And we started moving the books in August, and then opened to new students. The start of school was in this. The library was in this building.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I arrived, the first thing I was told by the staff was that it was my job to figure out where all the books were going to go on the stacks here, because they hadn't done that ahead of time. So I spent many long nights looking at volume counts.
So you were about to move, and the move wasn't planned.
The move was
well,
not
welcome
planned.
aboard,
Exactly.
Madam Director.
Excuse me. So we did that, and actually, the only thing I knew was Georgetown, so I sort of based the layout on how Georgetown was laid out, at least for the start. And of course, I think within a couple of years, I knew there were several the floors that had all the treatises, which are actually the 4th and the 5th, were going to be tight pretty quickly, and but we just put them there, and then we had to do some moving, but it worked out, and at least every book had a place to go in that for the move, and then I began by looking at the organization and figuring out what things we were doing here in terms of services, and started on my own strategic planning process with my new staff, and sort of the rest is history, really. We do fairly regular planning processes, and I think I've enabled the staff to sort of think from the micro to the macro as needed, and that's how we work. We do a lot of teaching. We're not part of the first year program, although from time to time, we're invited in to teach parts of what they call lawyering process, which is legal research and writing here. But we teach advanced legal research. We also teach something called practice-ready research, which is a 1 or 2 credit course.
I imagine some of the students flock to that.
That one's very
especially
popular.
the ones that have worked the previous summer in the real world. And
so that's a short
discovered they needed
course.
to know a tad bit more than they thought they did.
Exactly. So that's a fun one, and we're working on offering 1 credit specialized courses that would sort of complement we have certificates here in insurance and tax and human rights. So thinking of having.
How could I have guessed
I know.
insurance?
I don't know. How
Since it's
could
only
you?
Hartford, the insurance capital of the
Yeah.
country.
We have quite an insurance program here.
Yeah,
So
I bet you do.
and LLM as well as JD courses. So yeah, so we're teaching, and in the meantime, I passed advanced legal research off, and I've been teaching higher education law for nearly 10 years now. And this is quite a year for higher education. And
I
so
wouldn't be surprised.
it's
yeah.
I'll be teaching it in the spring, and I think I'm running backwards to figure out how I want to shoehorn in all of the different topics, because the higher or the university landscape is in turmoil right now. So
Oh. Well, I suppose we're in the midst of the 2016 presidential
right,
campaign right now,
Exactly.
and the candidates are extremely different one from the other. And
right,
I suppose you can't write the final syllabus until you
Right.
see who's going to be inaugurated
Right.
come next year, January. Because they're obviously, depending on
exactly.
what happens with the Congress
Yeah,
and everything,
exactly.
it may be, one ball game or a very
Yeah.
different one, presumably.
Yeah,
So we'll wait and see
yeah,
what happens. Now, you have a broader array of duties and responsibilities than just the library. I
Right.
notice you have this nice title, Associate Dean for
Right.
Academic Affairs, which I assume means you get to herd some of the cats
Right.
around here with the faculty.
yeah. So that began. We have again, I say new library. We have a new dean who's this. He's in. This is his fourth year, entering his fourth year, and he's from practice, and so he when he started, he had somebody was the academic dean, and she agreed to do it one more year after he started, but then she was done. And as most of us know, the academic dean generally comes from the faculty, and it just sort of they rotate on and off that position.
Yeah.
For the librarian to do it, it's a little different because I have a full-time job already as the library director.
That's right, you have another day job.
But what's fortunate is until very recently, I had Jocelyn Kennedy, who was my associate director. She has now gone on to be the director at Harvard. But in the meantime, she worked here for 5 years, and over time, when the opportunity came for me to be the academic dean, I promoted her to the title of director. So I'm still the associate dean for library and technology, but she got the title of director, and so she was running the library day to day, and that was working very nicely. And but unfortunately for me, she left, and so now I'm sort of having to manage that day to day.
You should have passed the word that you were just covering incompetence or
Exactly.
something. Then you could keep her forever till she found out, and then you wouldn't want to have her.
Exactly.
She'd be out looking for you.
I know she would be.
And rightly
Yeah.
so, because it
So-
wouldn't be true.
Yeah, she was. They were very excited to get her at Harvard, and it was a well-deserved opportunity for her because she is, she's a great person. But anyway, so in the meantime, we're just sort of waiting for permission to post her position. But in the meantime, as I say, I'm sort of managing both areas. But back to the academic dean. So I'm still, as you say, I'm sort of herding the cats of faculty, but also managing curriculum and scheduling and all the details that I oversee the registrar's office and other details as assigned, including just spending a lot of time in dean's meetings. So.
That's probably actually broadens your experience and keeps life from being sort of boring, if I dare use the term, after 20 years doing some of the same stuff.
Oh yeah, no, I love it. It's great. I feel it is broadening my understanding of running the law school, and because I've been here so long, I'm a good resource for the dean on sort of like why we do something we do, which in the end doesn't mean that we can't change it, but I just am able to give him a little history on where that
Well,
policy
you say he
came from.
came from outside the academy, from the practice,
Correct.
and
Yeah.
there are probably some helpful things that you can
Right.
suggest to help him,
Correct.
realize, some of the
Right.
reasons things are the way they are in
Right.
academic life.
Right.
Not that they may not need change, but
yeah.
he can then at least
Well, we're
have that
definitely-
picture if he decides on
We're
something.
definitely more slow moving than practice. He's learned to try to slow down his expectations.
Well, that's good.
So-
We almost hired a retired general for
Mm.
one of the places that I was in my early years. And,
Right.
but there were concerns that it wouldn't be a good mix.
Right,
Because
right.
he was used to giving the orders and having compliance. And
Right.
you know how faculty can be.
Yeah. Exactly.
Exactly. Well, now you, even with all these
Uh-huh.
responsibilities in-house,
Mhm,
you must have learned early on that access to your colleagues in the broader profession was of some use to
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
because you've certainly excelled at your professional
Mhm.
responsibilities, the service to ELL and
Yeah.
perhaps other entities out there.
Mhm.
I know here in New England, you've been
Mhm.
president of the Law Librarians of New England, which
Mhm.
is a chapter of
Yeah.
ELL. You have been not president, but you were treasurer, I believe, and on the
NELCA,
board
right.
of the New England Consortium.
Right, Law Library
Law
Consortium.
Library
Yeah,
Consortium. And of course, in
Mhm.
ALL, you've done an awful lot of stuff,
Right.
not the least of which is you
Right.
served a term
Yeah.
as president
Mhm.
of the association. And you were on the board before that and
Correct.
served as secretary. So
Correct.
you've done a lot of, more so than just about anybody else
Right.
I know, for the association and the other.
Mhm.
You want to talk a little bit about some of that experience and maybe even share why you considered it worth doing,
Mm-hmm.
especially in light of the demands from your now 2 day jobs.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think it was always early on. I felt the more I gave to the association and the profession as a whole, the more I, got back, and I have lifetime friends all over the country. Whenever a student comes up to the reference desk and says, I'm going to be in who knows where, Oklahoma for Christmas, is there a law library there? And I say, no problem, and I pick up the phone and call my colleague at that law library. And I just think it's just a wonderful lifetime of membership in an association that I felt I owed a lot to. And so and again, Bob Oakley, if anyone was my mentor besides Sharon Hamby, it was Bob, and he of course encouraged me to run for office.
And he was a
Yeah.
president and
Yeah.
in a lot of other roles, a
Correct.
major leader in our field
Yeah.
too.
And so he was very active in AALL, and as the Washington Affairs person, head of that office, he had a sort of a permanent seat on the board. So he always knew what was happening. So even when I was on the board, he was on the board with me. And so then we would, go back to the office and share notes. And so it was just it was, in my mind, it was sort of the expected next step kind of thing. And although I didn't think that I would actually run for president, I somehow didn't see that in the cards. I thought, secretary was fine. And so, when it came for me to run for president, I'm like, I don't know, because I knew that was a very time-consuming position, which it was. But ultimately, they convinced me to run, and I won, and that was just so much fun. All the travel, and by the time I had that position, Jocelyn Kennedy had started working here, so she basically, from that point on, was taking over the the day-to-day running of the library so
She
that I
got
could
a
travel.
quick start on
She did.
taking the
She
control
started-
for you
Yeah, she
on
started
your
that
behalf.
like January, and I was, already the vice president, and so yeah, so she took over, and it was an easy thing for me to do because she just was so capable.
You were lucky
And
she
so I was
started
very
in
lucky.
January,
Yeah,
because my
yeah.
memory is that the vice president
Yeah.
has a sort of an easy time
Yeah,
for a short while.
Yeah, and then-
the
yeah,
real work
it
begins.
really
of
starts
setting up
that
your
spring,
your
exactly.
administration.
And so she was here just in the nick of time.
Yeah.
And so I was lucky. And so she, as I say, sort of took over the day-to-day. I started doing the travel and got, very involved in the association work. And, I look back on some of the things that happened before I became president. I was involved early on in the initiative that was actually Bob's and Sally Holterhoff's with the Uniform Electronic Legal Materials Act, UELMA. And again, because of Bob's mentorship, I was invited to that first meeting where they called, I guess it was a summit, and they brought together a lot of stakeholders. And so once I was president, I was able to push the, to encourage different members of the association to, try to get it passed as a law in their own state. And in fact, here in Connecticut, I testified on behalf of UL, on behalf of AALL for UELMA. And so that was a pretty important, I think, piece of what I did as president. And then in addition to that, I had a summit on what I call sort of the future of AALL, but it was really about bringing, it was about the future, meaning the younger members. And I would say the topic that really interested me a lot was bringing in sort of I don't know if they were the millennials or Generation X, but getting them more involved. And because I think there was a belief on their part that the association might not be as important for them in their careers. And we were sort of old and fuddy-duddied. And that was actually while I was while I was still vice president, that Joyce Janto was the president, that we stopped having the closing banquet because there was a belief that the younger members would never come to that and they didn't appreciate it. And so we were sort of trying to figure out what would keep them engaged in the association. And so I had this future summit where I invited a lot of younger semi-active members to sort of talk about that. And so I feel like that was sort of an important initiative that I began.
Well, I think the closing banquet, as much as many of us old timers,
Right,
miss it.
right,
The die was cast
Yeah.
earlier. I mean, we always had a history of many tables being unoccupied, or
Right.
at least many seats.
yeah, exactly.
Because a lot of people would not or could not stay over for another night.
Right,
They would-
and it was an expensive meal, and
then we ticketed it beginning
Correct.
when I was president at cost.
right, of course.
But it
yeah,
was still boggling
yeah,
the mind to see what
Exactly.
these things do really cost
right.
per person
Right.
in a major facility like a
Exactly.
convention
It
center
was pricey.
or a large
yeah,
hotel. And up until then, they had been sort of buried in the registration,
Right,
and often, up until pretty much then,
Right.
subsidized by the
Right.
Old West Publishing Company.
right,
And so the association was faced
Right.
with, either raising the
right,
registration considerably
right,
or making it an option that you could
Right.
opt into or out of. So you could
Right.
get a full registration, that would be the banquet. If you had the other registration, it would be everything else
Correct.
but the
yeah,
banquet.
correct.
And I think the die was cast once that was
Right.
became so obviously so
Right.
expensive that. So it doesn't surprise
Yeah.
me that many of our younger members looked at it perhaps differently than some
Right,
of us did
yeah.
in our day.
It was, I think that was a tough thing, but it was, and also because the registration for the meeting in general obviously has gone up, and not all of the members are lucky enough to have, full, their workplace pay for their, travel or their entire registration or whatever it might be, so.
Yeah. Our colleague Frank Hodek, who is part of
Right.
this legislative oral history
Right.
project, has described the current times as, let's see, he's got several phrases. One of them is sort of the difficult times,
Right.
or trying times.
Right.
And he's right, because, we've had to learn to do
Right.
things in ways that were less costly.
Correct, yeah.
And as well as cope with all the tremendous changes in what a library collection is today
Exactly.
versus what it used to be.
Yeah.
And that's always, that's
Right.
challenging in its own way.
Well, because when I first came here, I came from Georgetown and Boston College and all these schools that had these very well-regarded research collections, and that was what we were building here as well. And then you get to a point where it's just not possible, nor do you really need to do it anymore. And between all the electronic databases, and then we have Yale right down the road, Harvard not too far away. So, and that Nelco group.
You're right in the middle, sort of. Well, not quite right in the middle,
Right.
but you are in the middle of the two.
But yeah, and the New England Law Library Consortium that we're talking about, we have a very good ILL program amongst those libraries, and so you do have to start sort of questioning what you're purchasing, and then and also people just use libraries very differently now than they used to. So.
Well, there's a standing joke I keep hearing as I make the rounds doing these conversations, and that it basically has the student at a table like you're sitting
Yeah.
with a bunch of books behind him, just
Right.
as there are behind you, but a screen in front of the student's face.
Right.
And the punchline is, if it's not on that screen, that student has
Right.
no idea that exists.
Exactly.
I just don't really use books as
Yeah.
was the case
Right.
a while back.
Yeah. Very true.
And
Yeah.
not necessarily for bad reasons
Yeah,
that
exactly.
they don't use them. I mean,
Right.
it's a lot of stuff on that on the databases
There
now.
is a lot of stuff here, right?
Yeah.
So.
Well, Darcy, we are sort of nearing, I think, the end of our conversation today, but it's my custom to sort of ask if there's anything we've not talked about that you would like to bring up. And I do have a topic I'll bring up right after you have your word.
So I just thought I would just add a little bit about my hobbies.
All right.
And,
that was the one I was going to ask. You preempted me. Good, because it was up in the earlier in the script, but we sort of moved around it, and I figured, well, I'll get to it now.
Yeah, because I'm a part of a women's competitive rowing team, and it's been really a great. I don't really consider myself an athlete, but and I never really participated in sports, competitive sports in high school or college, but. This here in Hartford, we have a community rowing group that's the boathouse is just north of the city. It's very close to here. It just takes about 15 minutes to get here from work, even in rush hour. And then I'm on the water, so I row 4 days a week during the season, and it's a wonderful lot of fun. I'm the oldest member of the team now, and then we have women who are from right out of college up into me, and we just in August went to the Masters Nationals competition, which was in actually Worcester, Massachusetts.
So this isn't just a little casual group of goes out on the water. You sound like you're all rather taking it seriously.
At the we call it the Old Lady Boat. The Old Lady Boat won a bronze medal at the Masters Nationals. And
congratulations to you and your fellow I think the word athlete is probably appropriate.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a great stress reliever, and it's, you know, there are people that I would never have met otherwise, and we just have a lot of fun together. And again, I feel lucky to have found it sort of late in life. I've been doing it about 15 years now, so. And it's a lot of fun. And when I was writing the president's columns for AALL, I, as often as I could, sort of wove it back to a rowing, analogy. And so I had sort of fun with those columns.
Well, I don't want to embarrass you at this point. Have you read the Boys in the Boat?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was a fun read.
Isn't that a great
and
book?
for our
Yeah.
viewers,
Right.
It's about the a team actually from the University of Washington,
Correct,
out
yeah.
near where I live,
Yeah.
that competed in the Olympics and became the
Yeah.
American representative for the 8-boat team in the Olympics in 1936 when they
Right.
were in Germany
Right.
under Hitler and
Right.
his leadership, and it was fascinating, and they won.
And they won by just a hair.
Yeah, but they won. They almost didn't. I
I
mean, the
know.
way the book
Oh, the way
describes
they-
it,
yeah,
there was every
where their
opportunity
boat
for
was.
everybody else that was
Exactly.
not given to them.
Exactly.
They were
Exactly.
positioned in the wrong part of
I
the
know,
river, so
and-
they'd have
And
resistance
then
to
their
water.
stroke was sick.
Yeah,
and,
but as I recall, he raced.
he did still race, but he had like
Yeah.
pneumonia or something.
Yeah.
I mean, it was crazy. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a wonderful book. Yeah.
It really is. I understand they're going to make a movie of it, and there has already been
A PBS,
a
yeah,
PBS
yeah.
American Experience,
Yeah, that was
which
good,
was very
yeah.
well done. I have a niece who has just now graduated from the University of Washington, and she watched the guys when they were producing that American Experience actually go out on the
Right.
Lake Washington
Right.
and get film from distance, so
right.
that you don't see everything about
right,
who they are,
right,
but.
right.
They were dressed in the old.
I figured that's what they must have
they were
done.
dressed in
Yeah,
period
right,
costumes,
right.
and they even got a couple of boats out from
Older boats,
the
yeah,
old boats
right.
that are still available,
Yeah, yeah.
that are never used, but
Right.
they
They
were the
still
ones
have
from
it.
that vintage.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
beautiful. It's just
yeah.
beautiful.
So
Yeah.
it was sort of I guess, an interesting experience to watch
Right.
all this happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that sounds, like you have some interesting,
Yeah.
activity or hobby or however
Right.
you want to describe it.
Right, and then when you talk about boys in the boat, I should just mention that the other thing I'm involved in is 2 book groups,
Uh-huh.
and one of them is a faculty / sort of attorney, judge, whatever book group, and it was my former dean had gone to, I think it was some other law school, it might have been Arizona, I'm not sure, where they had he was visiting there, and they had a reading group that was run by the dean and the librarian, and then they invited in lawyers, judges, and the faculty, and they read one book, every month or so. And so that dean has long gone, but I'm still running that book group, and so we read. I because I get to pick the books, had them read Boys in the Boat.
Well, why not? Yeah.
So we have fun.
It is a very fun read.
It is.
And
Yeah.
I was struck by of course, I grew up in Seattle.
Yeah.
I knew the places they were
I
talking
know.
about.
I want to. I've been to Seattle, but now I want to go back and see it all from.
Yeah. Well, that railroad track that used to run the trains up, following the boats as they raced on the lake,
right.
is now a trail.
Is it?
Yeah,
Interesting. Yeah.
It was a track for bringing in coal from the nearby mountains, and in those days, a lot of stuff was powered, including all the heating plant at the University of
Right.
Washington, by that coal.
Yeah.
Now they use something a tad bit cleaner, I hope.
Yeah.
In fact,
Well, I
know
think
they
what
do.
was interesting about that book was how popular rowing was in those days.
Yes,
Everyone
that was
listened to
the
it on the
major
radio.
collegiate sport.
I know. It's like, wow, who knew?
Yeah, I would have thought football, although that
Right.
was still really
Right.
major, but
Yeah.
rowing was
Yeah, it was very popular. And
really
everyone was
dominant.
like hanging on every stroke.
Yeah, very much.
So anyway, yeah. So
Well, you've talked about your various activities. Is there any other activity that you do that you haven't mentioned?
Yeah, no, I mean, I just love the out of doors. So, and my husband and I met kayaking actually, and we've done a lot of camping and hiking in our day. But so I think when I discovered the rowing, it was just sort of a great, sort of pulled together everything. And the idea of going from my desk, with whatever's going on in the library, and then in a half an hour I'm out on the water, and we're just north of the city, and you round the bend of the river, and then you're in just total, wilderness, or it feels like wilderness.
Must be a
Yeah.
fantastic way to sort of relax.
It is. It's really, really nice.
Let the
and,
cares of the office.
exactly.
and
Everything
world
goes
sort
away,
of
and you just
be
sort of
behind you a little.
exactly, and you just sort of focus on your next stroke. It's great. Yeah.
Well, maybe with that said, Darcy Kirk, I should thank you for participating this evening. Coming in, actually,
Yeah.
we're doing this on Sunday
Sunday
evening.
night. Yeah.
So if the people look hard at the date and say, what was that? That's Sunday that year. It really is. We are really
is
here
Sunday.
doing it Sunday evening.
Yes, and
I appreciate your
Yes, and
willingness to accommodate my rather tight schedule, since this trip I'm doing 41 of our colleagues.
41, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also, Patrick and I go way back from when we both worked in DC at the same time. So it's great for me to be able to see you again.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I've been sort of aware of what you were doing,
Yeah.
but it's better to come here and actually physically see it
Yeah.
and see you
Yeah.
to really bring everything,
Yeah.
including our friendship from
Yeah.
then, back to sort of a conscious state.
Exactly. So.
Yeah. And actually, I not only thank you for myself, since I have the opportunity and pleasure of being the one that got to come here and do this, but I'm also thanking you on behalf of Michelle Wu, who of course is down
Right,
at
at
Georgetown,
Georgetown, right.
as director, and Frank Kodak, who is now a retired,
Right.
associate dean,
Yeah,
various sorts.
right. He's
He
had
was an
many
acting dean at one point
Exactly.
at
He
the
was
school.
I haven't been an acting dean yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Frank and I go way back. He was the chair of the very first committee I was on for ALL, and I think it was publications, and he actually was probably the first person within the profession who sort of helped me navigate my way into the association and all of
I
that.
have served as a member of
Yeah.
a committee fairly recently that he chaired, and he's a workaholic.
Oh my
The
gosh.
right way.
Yeah,
kind of
he's
chair. He
a
made it
great-
very easy
He's a
for
great
all of us.
committee chair.
Yeah.
Great committee
But
chair.
he didn't take away what we were doing. He
Right.
just, made it,
He
empowered
supports,
us to
yeah.
do it.
Oh, he does. He's
very
great.
well.
Yeah.
And of course, in thanking you, I don't want to
Yeah.
leave off the third of our colleagues with whom I have the opportunity and honor to be doing these history interviews, and that's Dick Spinelli. Dick doesn't actually do any of them, but
Right.
he's more than just a supportive
Right.
person. In fact, I think he and Michelle were the ones that decided that this might be something that ought to be done. And,
Yeah, it's a great.
and he
a
invited
great
me to be
project.
part of it. So I'm beholden to Dick big time.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pat.